Today we're going to be talking about the indirect statement. Now, the indirect statement, the first thing we have to understand is what an indirect statement is in English. As you can see in these two instances where we have these people right here, they're talking to each other. And they're talking to each other here. What happens is Tom here, he's going to say, I want to go home. And Sally tells him, well, go home. And Sally comes over here and she's going to do a little bit of gossiping. And she's going to tell Bob and Joe, you'll never believe what Tom said. Tom said he wants to go home. Now, the indirect statement comes from this. The direct statement is, I want to go home. Now, if you put that in quotations, you're going to get a direct quotation. Tom said, I want to go home, in quotations. Now, an indirect statement is whenever she tells these other two guys what he said without using the quotation marks. Tom said, and then she paraphrases, he wants to go home. Well, he actually said, I want to go home, but she changes it up a little bit. And that's what we call an indirect statement, an indirect quote. Tom said he wants to go home. So when we look at this, let's look at our tendencies. In English, what we're going to get is, usually we're going to get a subject, then we're going to get a verb. Usually it's going to be a verb of mental action, thinks, it can be says, believes, any of those mental action verbs are going to work out. In English, we'll get a subject followed by another verb and then a direct object. Of course, in this case, we get an infinitive phrase, which replaces the direct object. In Latin, however, it's going to change up a little bit. We're still going to get a subject. We're still going to get a verb of mental action. But then instead of a regular subject, we're going to get an accusative subject. We should be used to this because the accusative subject is what we use as the subject of an infinitive action. Then we're going to get our infinitive followed by the direct object. So for this sentence right here, this indirect quotation or this indirect statement, Tom said he wants to go home, how would we get that into Latin? I'm going to give you a second to think about that. Write it down if you want to. What we should have is a subject for Tom. We're going to make sure that it's in the nominative case like the subject should be. We're going to use the verb said. So we'll use dixit, said. Now, here's where we're going to differ from the English. The English has another nominative form, he. We're going to use an accusative form. The accusative of him is say. And if we remember right, we get no nominative form of that reflexive. But for the genitive, we get sui. For the dative, we get sibi. For the accusative, we're going to get say. And for the ablative, we're going to get say. And that is a third person reflexive pronoun. It means himself, herself, itself. So Tom says that he wants, that is, in English, a regular verb. In Latin, we're going to have to use an infinitive, which is, wants is the infinitive of volo, which is vele. To go home is an infinitive phrase, which is replacing our direct object. To go is ire, and then home is domum. And that's how we create the indirect statement or indirect discourse, indirect quotation in Latin. We're going to get a subject. In this case, it's going to be Tom. We're going to get a main verb of mental action. We're going to get an accusative subject of the infinitive action. And then we're going to get a direct object, or in this case, an infinitive phrase. Let's look at some samples of this. We'll start with this sentence right here. Euclides, dicet ludum, Lacrum chlorum, esse optimum. Our subject is Euclides. Dicit is our verb. That's says, not said this time. That's present tense. We don't have dixit. Dixit would be said, past tense. He says. Now we're going to get the accusative subject of the infinitive. So he says. We would a lot of times in English we would put the word that. He says that the game. We get a genitive modifying that accusative of robbers. You can say to be right here for this infinitive if you want to in English. We're just going to use it as is. Is, and then the adjective that modifies, that modifies ludum is the best. And of course, he means the best game. I would translate that as Euclides says the game of robbers is the best. We have to remember that there is a relationship between infinitives and their main verbs. We look at this chart here. We have 3 tenses of the infinitive, which include the present, the perfect, and the future. We can have an active or passive infinitive. And depending on what tense I have, for example, if I have present tense, which is, of course, marked by that RE, actively, a passive would be the RI, I would translate that as the same time with respect to the main verb. If I get a perfect tense, that's the issa form or the fourth principal part plus essa, then I would translate it as action that happened before the main verb. Future is the URU plus the essa. We start that one with the fourth principal part. Hopefully we remember how to form these. And then the passive future is the ND plus the essa. And we translate those as after with respect to the action of the main verb. So let's change that sentence that we just did. Euclides says, that's present tense. We have an infinitive that is perfect tense. So this action happens before the present tense. So I would translate that as Euclides says the game of robbers was the best game. This action happens before this action. Down here we have Euclides says, that's present tense still. And then we have futurum esse, which is future, so that has to happen after. So Euclides says the game of robbers will be the best game. And that is how we create the indirect discourse, indirect quotation, and indirect statement in Latin.